I find there's no normal day really, you know, particularly after having weeks and weeks of no calls on a Wednesday night. You sort of get a bit complacent, you know, keep Wednesday nights free, don't do anything, which is fine. So there's no rhyme or reason for things happening. But sure as the eggs, if I decide to do something, get a couple of calls that night. No normal days. But certainly most incidents, if they're fairly serious, they don't finish with that one day on the roster. There'll be follow-up calls the next day. There might be follow-up calls 2 or 3 days later. The contact with that victim might last 2 or 3 phone calls, or it might last 25 visits. There's no rhyme or reason. Certainly the type of tragedy or grief, you know, does decide really what type of contact you're going to have, but some people feel that after a couple of phone calls or a couple of visits they don't need any more support, they've got family around them. So even a similar sort of like a car accident, you know, you treat the victims differently, or they would treat you differently depending on their support needs.
Yeah, it's sort of like the start of a case is a bit like a triage setup, isn't it? You settle down with the victim as much as you can, find out what their needs are, and then you go forward with emotional support or practical support or whatever's required.
The immediate.
Yeah, and then it just rolls out until, the other thing I like about it, it is the victim that really decides they don't need us anymore. And when it gets to that point, you know, you've done the job as best you can, and they've started to move on, which is the whole point of the exercise, really.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, part of them moving on is having nothing to do with us, and that's perfectly fine. Even if they completely ignore you in the street, well, that's good. But don't take any offence to that whatsoever. Actually, that's part of them moving on and trying to put their new normal back together.
Yeah, it's actually about their journey, not about us. It's about their coping journey, and